this is the title of my lecture, The Next 30 Years, Planning Cities Beyond Mobility. And I must give a bit of a context. So this lecture is based on a contribution I did, which has been published last year in theme issues of the journal European Planning Studies, celebrating their 30 years of history, and using that to look backward and forward. So what have we done in planning in the last 30 years, and what should we do in the next 30 years? And it's a very interesting theme issue. I really advise you to have a look at it. And I really like how the two editors, Dominique Stead and Louis Albrecht, introduced the issue, saying basically that we really need to rethink planning. We have planning historically has been about reducing uncertainty, maintaining the social order, and things like that. Well, the present context demands a totally different planning, a planning that embraces uncertainty and rather questions the social order and explores alternatives. So that's certainly the case also for mobility. And my looking backward, if I look 30 years backward, we see the emergence of what has been known as the sustainable mobility paradigm, which has tried, I would say, for 30 years at least, to kind of contrast the dominating individual motorized car-centric mobility planning. And my point is that maybe we should move beyond that alternative for two reasons. One is because we really don't see change on the ground. I mean, we see small change, but not of the size which is needed. But two, and maybe more interesting, because if you look what's happening, emerging practices, emerging theories, we might already be moving beyond the idea of putting mobility at the center altogether. And I hope that why I say this and what I mean by this will be clear by the end. But again, please feel free not to agree, to be perplexed, take notes about questions. Okay, now, yeah, and my talk is organized broadly around these three headings. So why we should planning beyond mobility? What is that? What could that concretely entail? And how we can do it, which is quite a crucial question. So let's start with the why. And if I were there with you, I would ask at this point, okay, what do you think is the problem with mobility and cities right now? What do you think are key issues? We would have a discussion, maybe some, I could put everything in a word cloud. I'm not doing that, but maybe before I show you the next slide, start thinking, okay, what is the problem with mobility? What else are for you key issues? And I wait a couple of seconds to let your imagination work, and then I'll show you a list I came up with. So, okay, this is my list, and you might have a different one, and probably you didn't have time enough to think at all the issues, and I'm perfectly open to the idea that you might have other issues there. You might think that some of the issues here are not that important, but the key point here I want to make the key points are two. The first is that it's a very diverse range of issues. You see climate change there, of course, that's a very important one. You see other things have been longer on the agenda, like safety, congestions, etc., etc. But it's not the only one. Even climate change is not the only one. Even if we solve climate change, there will be a lot of other issues. And that's a very important point of departure. Without going into detail in each of these issues, let me say that there are broadly three categories of issues. The first one, like air and noise pollutions, well, these are issues that you can imagine that technological change in transport, for instance, electric vehicles, could by and large solve that. I mean, in terms of the air quality of cities, noise of cities. So, okay, that's where technology, transport technology, could be an answer, which is more or less the direction in which most governments are going. Then there is a second category of issues where there are climate change, emissions, use of non-renewable resources, energy, accidents, congestions. Again, this is an interesting category because, yes, you could say, yes, transport technology might address some of these, maybe not in the form it's available now, but let's think, I don't know, not just electric, but also self-driving, shared cars. Okay, within certain conditions, these issues might be addressed. But if you go a bit into the literature, you say that here is much more contested. I mean, yes, electric vehicles could reduce carbon emissions, but how about how that electricity is produced? I mean, only if it's produced by means of renewables. How about batteries? Batteries have huge issues of being dependent of finite resources, also resources extracted with a lot of negative impacts of the environment on people in countries like Congo and so forth. So there is discussion here. Going to self-driving cars, yes, they might help reducing congestion, maybe freeing parking space. But what about the fact that anybody, even without a driver license, even not able to drive a car, would maybe, profit from that opportunities? Maybe we'll have many more cars driving around, so making congestion worse, not better. And if we think that, things like Uber and other similar companies, playing the same, and what you're seeing is that congestion is not becoming less, but more in cities where these practices are widespread. So again, maybe something technology can do, but that's much more contested. And then, and maybe most importantly, there's a third set of issues that I think for me, but also for us as urban planners, are really crucial, because basically these are issues in which technology cannot play any role. It can even worsen some of this. Is a technological breakthrough means that more people will drive that are driving now. Think of the lack of physical movement, the fact that we don't use our bodies to move, with all sort of health, mental and physical health implications. Think of the fact that mobility in its motorized form breaks up communities, ecosystem. Think at occupation of public space. Think how much public space is occupied by moving and parked cars. We accept this as normal one, but just I show it also in a while. Take a picture of any cities 100 years ago or something. We see a very different image of the streets that we are used to. I mean, mobility is just one of many uses. So all these issues are issues dealing with the use of space, which is monopolizing, inefficient, of the present mobility system, and technology, transport technology, will not change anything about this. So that's why we need to look beyond mobility, again, to address more issues and to give enough space also to issues that technology cannot solve in any way. And if you would like to have some evidence, a very useful recent publication is this article entitled "Car Arm" by Manner and others, who does a great work of synthesizing what we know, in this case, focus on cars and automobility, which of course is the main type of mobility we are talking about. And here you see very well how many issues and how many diversity of issues and how many ways they are the present mobility system has a negative impact on people and the environment. And again, if you see this picture, if you read this article, would be an interesting question: how much of this do you think electric vehicles can solve? Which is basically the only strategy that many governments and other stakeholders are proposing. I mean, my claim and of others is that a very few of these can be solved by such a technological solution. Some may be solved, and many others will not be solved at all. So that's why we really need to look beyond that narrow focus. Okay, so that's the why, and please, again, feel free not to agree, to contest, to add things, take things out. But let's move to the second point. So, okay, what is it? This planet beyond mobility? What kind of things are we thinking about? And again, this is not a new paradigm, a formula. It's not a new textbook. It's what it's emerging in practice, in theory. So that's why maybe the way to look at it is more what if. There are many uncertainties, ideas to explore, and actually in my article I use literally for each of these building blocks, I always introduce it with a what if question. So it's not anything is not certain about here. These are hypotheses. So again, please free to contradict this. And I have five building blocks to introduce. So the first one, and really maybe the most crucial in many ways, it's literally the street. I anticipated it. The idea that streets, what if streets were for people, not for traffic? And we heard this slogan maybe other times, but the point is beyond the words, is discovering or maybe rediscovering the street as a public space with multiple functions. Because what we sometimes seem not to realize is that it's not just about cars occupying the street. It's really about a very different idea of the street that basically has been for thousands of years before the advent of the car. And this is well shown by these three pictures from the same street in Amsterdam, where if you look at the 80s, by the way, you see also how Amsterdam may be full of bicycles now, like you see in the last picture on the right. It was also full of cars, so things are not, even in Amsterdam, things have been different. But if you compare the most recent picture with the one from the 19th century, what you see, it's not just that there were no cars. What you see in the 1868 picture is that moving around, mobility, which could be by car, by bike, any other means that you see in the 2021 picture, is just one about many functions. You see people, walking in the street, talking to each other, children playing. So what has been lost with the advent of the car is not just, the car with all the environmental issues, but the very idea and practice of the street as a public space with multiple uses. So that's the first thing to recover. And some cities are, exploring this. For instance, the city of Groningen in the Netherlands has a new document about the future of their public spaces, where they have this principle, and of course, it's a whole challenge to implement it, which is called the 10 dimensions of our streets. So streets are not for one thing, are certainly not just for traffic, and traffic, again, could be bicycle as cars or buses, but it's at least for 10 different things, public space uses, but also, for instance, becoming more and more important, climate adaptation uses, planting trees, creating surfaces where water could permeate, and so forth. And what we also see booming around the world are experiments to try to explore this different use of streets, temporarily suspending the traffic and parking function and exploring different uses, which of course means understanding possibilities, but also limitations. And I will get back to that in the third part of the lecture. But with these experiments already seen, and this is the literature review I did a few years ago, that the impacts of these changes, these temporary changes, are not only about a different mobility, which you would expect, less car, more walking, cycling, and so forth, but there is also a lot about the other issues that I started with. Livability impact, more social interactions, neighbors that didn't talk to each other that start talking to each other, sense of community, physical and mental health impact. So you see at this very basic building block, this broadness of impacts and issues on the floor. So again, it's not just about air and noise pollution. It's not just about modal shift. It's really about recovering the social dimension of the street and public space in general. But of course, mobility is not an end in itself. It's a means to achieve resources that are important to us, jobs, education, friends, services, etc., etc. So if we really start using streets in this very different way, of course, there will be less room for individual fast motorized mobility. How to get access to things that are important to us. And here is where the second building block, which I call here accessibility by proximity, but quite pragmatically mean prioritizing accessibility by walking and cycling. So, having as much as possible access to what is essential for us on an everyday basis by means of walking and cycling, which is a way of accessing resources compatible with the idea of the street I just advanced, because walking and cycling are the most efficient ways of using space in terms of mobility, like 10 to 40 times more efficient than the car, but they also allow interacting with other people, with environment. So they're also very consistent with the idea of the street as public space. And this, of course, the idea that's been popularized by concepts like the 50-minute city in Paris and applied by many others with the idea, let's, as much as possible, allow people to get what they need as an option, not as an obligation, within 50 minutes of walking or cycling. And what I want to stress here, of course, things like bike lanes or footpaths are important, But not only that, and to stress that, I want to use the example of Amsterdam. This is a map of all the bike lanes, the major bike lanes in Amsterdam. As you see, is a quite expansive network, which of course is good. But I want to zoom in on two neighborhoods in Amsterdam, New West and West, which are close to each other, but they show quite a different mobility behavior. So here I zoom in again. In green, you see all the major bike lanes, and what you see is quite interesting. So there's basically no difference in the density or the quality of the cycling network, but there is still a huge difference is the share of the bicycle in West and New West. As you see, public transport is more or less the same, but there's a huge shift from the bike to the car if you go from West to New West and the other way around. So what might explain that? Well, a very important thing that might explain that is is in the next picture, which is a picture mapping all the non-residential functions, so everything with the exception of houses in the two neighborhoods. And here you see a striking difference. You see a much higher density of those other functions and also a diversity in West, the New West. So when we talk about the 50-minute city, accessibility by cycling and walking, it's crucial. It's not just bike lanes or footpaths. It's really about this fine-grained mix of functions. We might be there, at least in some part of European cities. And so in that case, maybe bike lanes and footpaths are enough, but in others are not. So you have to be creative and understand, okay, how can we get more of that mixing? Again, remembering that mobility is not an end in itself, but it's a way to access education, work, services, other people, etc. And it's not just about cities. I keep talking about cities, but many people don't live in cities, at least if we think cities are dense, compact, central location. Many people in Europe live in the suburbs, in the countryside, or on the periphery of the city. And there it might be even more of a challenge having this mixture and density. And maybe there is where we have to learn to be more creative, like these residents from a village in the Netherlands did with the last supermarket was closed. And the supermarket was not just the place where local people could do the groceries by walking and cycling, but was also a very social place, a place where people would meet each other, have a chat, get to know what's going on. And they decided to take it over because the company was going to close it and run it themselves to keep this social, commercial, but also social place alive, showing how again, it's not just about bike lanes and footpaths, but it's about keeping that density and diversity of destinations there. And when that's not there, there are functions that are not reachable within those 50 minutes of walking and cycling, and maybe not on an everyday basis, but every once that might be the case. There are more special activities. Well, here the idea is what I call diffuse transit-oriented development, and transit-oriented development is something very well known for years. But the point I want to stress here is that diffused. And again, moving on from the idea that not everybody lived in the dense, diverse cities where transit-oriented development have been applied mostly in the past. So let's explain what I mean by this. So this is classic transit-oriented development. It's a very famous example. Copenhagen in Denmark, that since right after World War II, start developing the city around public transport, this famous finger plan. So the idea was to develop the city along the line of transport lines, so to ensure that the two were connected, that people could use public transport to move around, and they've kept updating the project, the idea, as far as the city grew. This is the classic example. There are also other examples around the world, but that's not really what I'm bringing here in. And let me explain again more in detail. So that's the classic TOD idea. You have high capacity, high speed public transport, rail based, or maybe a bus rapid transit. And then you have a concentration of function, high density, offices, shops, residents at the stream. Okay, this works, but works only in a very few contexts. Think, the cities, maybe the center could be organized by that, maybe a few other places. But how about the rest of the region or the country? Not here we have a situation which is, very different. A lot of the housing, but maybe also other destinations, as much more spread, are not close to these main stations. We have there also, valuable landscape, agriculture, natural landscape that we don't want to build up with infrastructure, with major developments. What to do there? So here is where the diffused idea come in, and it has a number of elements. The first is to think more in what is called trip chaining, about combining different modes. So combining public transport with other public transport, also with walking, cycling, possibly the car. Maybe in this context, self-riding cars have some use, but again, as part of this bigger whole. And of course, this is also the context where to experiment with innovative, lighter, demand-based idea, public transport idea, like social taxis, demand-responsive transport, but also e-bikes, of course, which can increase the range of bikes and make all sorts of connections possible. And one example that show how this could work is the bike-train combination in the Netherlands. Just to put some numbers there, 4 out of 10 of the people coming to a station in the Netherlands to take a train come there by bike. And this is, you cannot understand the train system or the bike system if you don't think them together. And they're really complementary. The train is fast, but it's not very flexible. The bike is very flexible, but not very fast. If you combine the two, you have a system which is both flexible and fast, and which in many contexts is competitive with the car. So again, this is one idea, and it's not the only example of how this much more diffuse system can work. And then let us not forget the stations are also places, and maybe it's obvious in city centers with all those concentration of functions around stations, but it can also happen in very small stations and even in rural contexts. For instance, these are very interesting initiatives by the Scottish Railways, is adopt a station where even in a very small station like this, just putting a bookshop in the station instead of somewhere else, you create something which is much more meaningful. It's a place that people use, and not just to travel, but also to do other things, meet, etc., which again contribute to this alternative way of accessing important things you need. Now, and you might ask, okay, what happens with the car in this vision? Of course, the car is there. There are situations where the alternatives are not there, or maybe are even less sustainable than the car. I mean, empty buses like we sometimes see in the countryside, are certainly not sustainable, for instance. But the key point here is that the car is an option complementary to all the rest. And again, consistent, remember, with that street, which is a public space. So it cannot be the sort of monopolizing solution that it is now, which kind of crowds out all other uses of public space and also all other dynamics that I've shown so far. So I keep saying again and again, but the electric self-driving car is still a car. Maybe not in some respects, but in many others, and most notably in the type of mobility it enables. The way it uses space is really no different from a conventional car. That would be different if you really see the car as part of a system where other ways of moving around are just as important or even more important and possibly connected by a digital interface. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the car is dominant in our cities and countries. It's in our habits, it's in our minds. So we need, it's not just carrots, we also need sticks. We need to also discourage the use of the car, certainly when there are alternatives. And this is a maybe more extreme example, congestion charging, which had quite an impressive impact in Stockholm, as you see here. But it's also just parking policy. It doesn't have to be that extreme. It requires addressing, of course, justice issue. I mean, as I stressed, are there alternatives? If there are not alternatives, you might only penalize people that are dependent on the car. Last but not least, freight. We tend to focus only on passenger, but a huge issue is, of course, also how we transport goods. And my what-if questions, that's also how I formulated it in the paper, is what if we need less of that? Because a lot of the solutions now are making efficient the system that we already have. But actually, that's not a system that reduces, it makes a bit less impactful, but it's not a fundamental change of the ones I'm looking for now. And here a thinking which we see also in other areas of sustainable development is useful, this avoid, shift, improve idea. So first of all, you should try and avoid something. Then if you can, to move it from one mode to another, which is maybe less impactful, is as a third to make it more efficient what you have. And actually, what we now see in a lot of transport, freight, logistics policy is actually the reverse order. So just improve, make vans more efficient, be sure they're always full. Only, if that really does not work on very difficult context, we might shift to, cargo bikes, for instance. Much more rarely you see that move, and hardly could we have less. Could we have less freight? Maybe by sharing more, by recycling more, etc., etc. Well, I believe that to keep, be consistent with the rest of the story, we really need to reverse the order and start there by asking ourselves, can we reduce the need for goods to be moved around, and only then move to shifting and improving. So these are some ideas. Again, what if hypotheses, let's discuss them. But before we go to the discussion, let me enter in the third and quite crucial thing. As I said at the beginning, one of the reasons to look beyond sustainable mobility is that we didn't see the the fundamental change, if you look back 30 years, that everybody has said we need. And when we do it, we get all, when we try and do things, we get all sorts of resistance. So we really need to find ways of acknowledging that resistance. So this has become a more and more important question: how to enable transformative change. So change is really not a little bit more of this or that, but really different. It's clear that we need a different way of doing things and thinking things and organizing things. We cannot just adapt a little bit what we do. That's not working. It's not matching the issues we have to face. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that there is an incredible resistance to change. I named habits, mental, things in our heads, but also how the world is organized. So it's incredibly difficult. That's really maybe the most important questions that in any field planners should answer today. And as for mobility, there is also a very useful article by Mattioli and others that summarize why we depend so much on the car, and its culture, its infrastructure, its lobbies, it's how we are organized our cities and region. It's all what we keep doing to discredit the alternatives. So it's a very complex set of things we have to go to break through. And luckily there are some useful thinking on this more and more, and not just in the field of mobility, but more in general in the field of what's called transitions, all sort of ways of doing a bit what I'm sketching, but in other fields, maybe energy, maybe agriculture, etc. And well, I will not go in this theory about how things change, but one thing I want to stress, that most of this theory, if not all of these theories, start with experiments. Because of course, when we don't know how to change something, what to do, when something is difficult, you experiment. You want to try something out to learn about what is possible, what is limitations. You cannot just, make a model or have a discussion. You try it out. So all starts with experiments. And one useful concept is this of transition experiments. So you want something do something in the short term. So experiment is not about doing something in 30 years or not even 5, but now try out something now that you can do it, but where you're really trying out something different, a different organization of the city, a different culture, etc., etc. So it's this kind of almost paradox. And one example in the field of mobility, it's what I named at the beginning, is the street experiments. Again, this is something you can do. I mean, cities around the world are doing more and more of these things. So temporarily closing the street for traffic to use it for other uses, more active boats, but not just, and the Levy Street examples in the city of Ghent in Belgium is very clear. It's not just about moving from car to bicycle or walking, is also moving from the domination of traffic to rediscovering the street of a social place where children can play, you might meet neighbors. And of course, by doing something as this, you might discover what's in the way of it. Some people might be, accepting to have to walk 5 minutes to their car instead of having it in the front of their door, or maybe, might be happy to discover that they can even do things by bike or public transport. Other people might find this impossible or have big resistance. So this is the point of experiments. You want to really understand what is possible, but also what are limitations. But what is very strong of an experiment is really different from making plans, mathematical models, simulations, but even a discussion with stakeholders, is that people can experience it, can really experience what it means, what it would mean having a city which is not organized around the car. And it's not just experiment, of course. That's an important component. And again, here are theories. I don't want to go into detail, but it's about linking those experiment with the policy, what is called sometimes institutional politics, so the politics of making plans and policies, but also very important, linking that to the contentious politics of political protest and social movements, because we should not forget that we can do all sort of nice experiments, or we can hope this will lead to different plans and policy, but without pressure from society, nothing will happen. Things will stay as they are. So we need to link these different things with each other. So it's not just experiments like I show you, it's also linking that with things that maybe we are more familiar with, plans and policy as art planners, and also linking that to the protests, for instance, on climate change, and making one work together with the other, one create the dynamics that sets the other in motion. And if you look in the past, in situations, places and times where things did change, in the face of resistance to change in a fundamental way, we do see something which is similar to that. So let me close with example of Amsterdam. These are the share of cycling in a number of cities in Europe. And you might, after the World War II, and as you can imagine, suburbanization, motorization, dramatic fall in the share of cycling in urban mobility. What is interesting that in some cities, it never recovered, at least then, maybe in more recent years. But in some cities, and Amsterdam is one example, it did turn around in the 70s from decline to growth, and it's still growing. So it becomes super interesting to look, okay, but what happened there? What happened in such a moment? This I mean by transformative change. It's not a little bit more or less, it's a change of direction. Well, and these are some pictures from those years in Amsterdam, and quite interesting. You do see what we would call experiments today. And please be mindful that bike lanes did not exist at that time. So these were really the first worldwide experiments with something that could have become a bike lane. You see a plan which was crucial a bit later, shifting from this idea of functional separation and offices in the center, housing outside, and motorways and metros connecting the two, to a much more mixed cities, with trams, bikes, and most of all a mix of functions. But crucially, it was not just that. There were also years of very intense, social movements, protests, where were a lot about how the city was being changed. There were the biggest riots in the history of Amsterdam after World War II were actually against the metro and for maintaining housing in the old city. So we're really urban planning and transport planning riots. And if you dig into that, people being able to connect these different things were really crucial in making the change which I show. So my last claim, we need to learn to do that also in the world of today. So again, why? And that's the multiplicity of issues, and the fact that a big part of those issues cannot be solved by transport technology. We have really to look beyond it, a different way of moving around, not just a different technology. I made some hypothesis of components, which of course I'm not inventing, but you can see emerging around the world, and how with the big question that we really have to answer in mobility, but also in any other field, is how can we make transformative change? So not just a little bit more or less, but something really different in the face of resistance to change, and how experiments, but also connected to other types of politics, are an essential thing. And now I do hope we can have a talk with each other on these things. Thanks a lot.